here we are. Ready to wrap up the book of Job. Hasn't been a bunch of giggles, has it? And I apologize in advance that though I did try, Lord knows I did try, there's not much humor in this sermon either. Because I'm going to be talking about something that you need to be clear about, and Job wasn't clear about. See, sometimes bad things happen, even to us. And your age doesn't protect you, your wealth doesn't protect you, and oh, by the way, your faith doesn't protect you either. The opening chapter of Job says that God had put a fence around Job to protect him. But that was Satan talking. And that just wasn't the truth. The Old Testament book of Job has been variously described as everything from a holy white paper on the nature of God and human interactions to a morality play that strives to point out that God is different than us. And He's not looking to be more like us. So deal. Biblical scholars suggest this book is easily the oldest book in the entire Bible. It was the hardest to translate as well. It mentions creatures and conditions that were commonly understood at the time of writing, but that we have no idea to what they refer now. Some very early translations say the 1611 King James Version mentions unicorns. In Job 39:9, in Psalm 29:6, and Isaiah 34:7, to mention 3 places, it mentions unicorns. And also, the book never at any point mentions the Jews or the tribes of Israel at all, suggesting, therefore, to the biblical scholars that the book of Job actually predates the nation of Israel, maybe by millennia. But we're not going to do a scholarly fact check this morning, as fascinating as that might be to me. Rather, we'll wrap up the book of Job, emphasizing the truth about God as Job came to know it, not through big Sunday school, and not through the amazing pastors that no doubt he heard preached through his lifetime, by getting to know God through his struggles. Suggesting that we, that is you and I, might just learn the same way. How about that? Even through the toughest trials of your life, there may be some lesson that you and I can learn from it. Now, we'll get a little bit deeper than that here in just a moment. But before we do that, let's be in prayer together. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for the opportunity to be in this place this morning and to experience your love, first and second hand, both from you and from the people in this room. But we're not here for entertainment, and we're not here just for the amazing meal that's going to take place here in a few moments. We're here because we know that you have a word for us, an important word for us, that we need to hear, and if we're going to get everything out of it that we need to get out of it, we need to be open to it. So our prayer this morning is that we find a way to open our hearts and our minds and our ears to the words that you have for your people, and that I can find a way to get out of the way, so that it's not my words that your people hear, but the words of the Holy Spirit that you send to us. Amen. There was a movie that came out in the year 2000. I know for some of you that was like 12,000 years ago. But it was called The Perfect Storm. And it's about a small fishing boat named the Andrea Gale that went down in a huge storm in October of 1991 off the coast of Massachusetts with all hands. with winds hovering around 75 miles an hour and waves of over 40 feet crashing. Utility poles and trees and piers and seawalls simply disappeared. Flooding was extensive, invading the low-lying homes and closing roads and airports. This storm was bad on land, but at sea, it was far worse. See, a cold front from Canada was racing across the northeastern corner of the country while a hurricane was forming over the warmer waters of the Atlantic Ocean, and they were moving towards a collision that soon became known as the perfect storm. And the Andrea Gale was caught squarely in the crosshairs of the colliding storms. The fishing vessel went down sometime after midnight on October the 28th, 1991. And ironically, its search and rescue satellite-aided tracking system washed ashore a week later on a small island called Sable Island. And strangely enough, when the investigators found it, they found that the tracking device was switched off. And they wondered, was this an accident? Or was it a case of a storm so overwhelming, so devastating, that the captain of the ship simply turned the device off as a symbolic gesture of giving in to the worst storm he'd ever seen? And if that's the case, Brother Job would have understood. See, if you followed this series over the past 5 weeks, Job's story is so painful that his name has been linked to suffering itself. Job's perfect storm involved grief beyond description, physical pain that defied understanding, and a spiritual pain that might have been the worst of all, because Job came to understand that for some reason, the God who could have prevented his suffering chose not to. See, in Job's thinking, the God who had already noticed his faithfulness had decided to reward this faith with torture. And Job's friends not only didn't help, they certainly added to his misery. As the skies above him turned dark and a storm blew in around him, Job connected the dots between the stormy weather and his set of very difficult circumstances. God was punishing him. But he didn't know why. Now, friends, if you've ever known life-stopping hard times, you've known the storm. If you've ever known the heart-piercing grief of losing a loved one, if you've ever been betrayed or forsaken or cheated or abused, you've stood in the center of the storm. So we think the God in heaven, the very one the Bible tells us controls all things, and who at the same time has promised to love us always, this same God allowed it to happen. But why? How could this be? I thought God was good. So as the storm rolled in, Job never moved. As the rain pounded down, he sat in the clumpy, wet mass of dust and ashes, his open sores still running, his heart still broken. The friends stayed too, though they must have been terrified because, unlike Job, they still wanted to live. But also, unlike Job, they had never known what it was like to have multiple problems crashing in on them all at the same time. It was symbolic that the skies around Job were turning dark, and the wind and the thunder were coming ever closer to the little group in Job's story. The worse the weather became, the more Job related to it. He was living out the worst days of his life, dealing with the perfect storm of physical, emotional, and spiritual pain. But it's right there, in the apex of the storm, that some of life's most important lessons became apparent for Job and just maybe for us. Lesson 1. A perfect storm of suffering may overwhelm any of us at any time. Job's perfect storm involved, in an amazingly brief period of time, enemies attacking his ranches and his financial portfolio emptied, and worst of all, his family had been killed. In the aftermath, his own health deteriorated to the point that he wanted to die, and yet he could not die because God wouldn't let him. And through the worst of it, his friends had arrived and announced that the entire thing had to be Job's fault. They said, "Confess your sin, Job, and perhaps God will relinquish his attack against you. We know God is fair and just and right, so no matter how much you protest your innocence, God simply can't be wrong. So tell us, what did you do to deserve this?" It was a perfect storm that sank Job to the depths of discouragement as surely as the Andrea gale sank to the bottom of the North Atlantic. And some of us have been there, haven't we? When the funerals start arriving in an aging family, they seem to come in bunches. And then there's health issues. A person who has known only the best of health slams into a troubling symptom as if he'd been hit by a truck on the highway, and the problems begin to pile up, bringing tests and surgeries and treatments and expensive medical bills and thoughts of just giving up. And how about when the investments that you've counted on, that you've saved for your entire life, that you're trusted to be there when your retirement came, how about it when those tank? Or too many other calamities to even mention. And people of faith certainly aren't immune to such pressures, are they? Even David, God's chosen, often saying of the helpless nature of his struggle, "How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever?" Joseph, too, had a string of crushing disappointments. Sold by his brothers, betrayed by his employer's wife, stuck in a prison cell he didn't deserve. He must have been overwhelmed with discouragement. And Paul was so low during one of his letter-writing sessions that he told Timothy that one man had deserted him and only Luke is with me now. Paul had been beaten, chased, arrested, scourged, caned, imprisoned, denied justice, and eventually shipwrecked. And if that wasn't enough, he was snake-bitten as well. If a perfect storm of problems overwhelmed the greatest individuals in the Bible, including Job, we shouldn't be surprised when similar circumstances overwhelm us. It's as if Job held on to his faith and his sanity with his fingertips, barely able to avoid the chasm of complete destruction. Lesson 2. Let's be clear. A perfect storm might just drive us away from God. According to Scripture, Job was a great man of faith. He hadn't just gone through all the right motions, he also had the right heart to go with his actions. He'd been so faithful that he'd been the subject of a conversation in heaven. It went like this. "Have you ever considered my servant Job?" God asked Satan. "There's no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." But after the storm battered Job long enough, and after his losses became big enough, he began to have some serious questions about God, the God he thought he knew. The combination of pain and heartache and unending agony shattered his impression of the God that he had known. The logic was impossible to miss. If God was in control of everything, why had God allowed such suffering? If God noticed the faithfulness of one of his children, why would God reward that faithfulness with such pain? Why? 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 Now, make no mistake about it. Pain is an incredibly powerful tool of teaching, as some of us have had to learn. Great change has taken place when people connected with pain, even when the pain is in the life of someone else.
Yeah.
Consider Ezzeldin Abu al-Aish, a 55-year-old physician known to both Palestinians and Israelis. And because of his suffering, though you may not have heard of him, the entire world knows this man. His wife died from cancer. But before that, they had raised 8 children and made a remarkable impact on all of Israel. Abu al-Aish speaks fluent Hebrew and practices medicine on both Israelis and Palestinians. And armed only with a joyful spirit, he had become a popular national celebrity because of his regular appearances on Israel's national television news programs and his work on a number of peace projects. He had become one of the most loved men in the entire region. Well, during Israel's war against Hamas terrorists in January of 2009, Abu al-Aish and his family became trapped in their home in the Gaza Strip. In all, 18 members of his family were taking cover there. And every day, news anchors from all over Israel's Channel 10 called him to get first-hand reports of the fighting inside Gaza. On January the 20th, 2009, a tank shell landed on the doctor's home, killing 3 of his daughters and a 14-year-old niece. 2 other daughters were injured, and Ezzeldin himself had been hurt. Both sides, Israel and Hamas, blamed each other. But blame was pushed aside, and what became the central point of what was happening in that moment was the depth of a father's broken heart. He sobbed into the phone, and his cries were carried throughout the entire nation. "Oh God! Oh my God, my daughters have been killed," the father cried into the phone. "They've killed my children. Could somebody please come to us?" Sitting at his news desk for one of Israel's main evening news broadcasts, the anchor held his phone to the microphone. And for 3 minutes and 26 seconds, Abu al-Aish, his wailing was broadcast across the country. And the anchor fought off his tears, and at least one pastor preaching this as well. The anchor was stunned by the grief that was bombarding him and the entire nation. But shortly after, the fighting stopped on both sides. Later, after the funerals, like Job, Abu al-Aish demanded answers. But he said, "I'll be proud that my children were the symbol of the war. Their blood wasn't futile. Because of their loss, their sacrifice, a war was stopped." See, when the pain is severe enough or shocking enough, enormous change can take place. A war can stop in the Middle East, and faith can be lost in any country with any individual. Foundational beliefs can be shaken. Prejudices can crumble. And thoughts of God can take turns never before thought possible. Job's very public grieving led to that kind of change in him. He demanded a hearing with God called as the defendant. Job reviewed his life, his efforts at avoiding sin, his attempts to worship the very God who seemed now bent on his destruction. Job's suffering took him to the very edge of rejecting the God he had always served, always loved. And friends, if we run into similar circumstances of pain and suffering, it just might take us to the same place. Our final lesson. What Job finally learned, and we can learn from Job, is that the truth of God is most clearly revealed to us in the worst moments of our suffering. Sometimes life's most difficult circumstances lead to life's most enlightening moments. In the classroom of suffering, and perhaps only there, life's most important lessons can be learned. It was certainly that way for Job. Job had longed all his life to know God. He had brought the offerings. He had kept all the rules. And he had a righteous heart. But it was only in his suffering, in the very worst of his suffering, that he met God in the deepest way. In the very storm that had nearly devastated him, Job met God. Of course, the meeting didn't go exactly as Job had hoped it would. God spoke to Job directly, challenging him to answer God's question and to stop asking so many of his own, because he couldn't understand the answers anyway. The human mind can't know the mind of God. How ironic. It took the worst days of Job's life to bring him to the place where he finally was able, in the words that God shared with him, to fully experience God. No longer had Job simply heard about God or talked of God. Now Job truly knew God and his nature. And even in continuing crushing loss, Job accepted. How many stories could you and I tell of those who found God only when they hit real rock bottom in their life? When people face life-threatening moments, they often seem to come face to face with the ultimate truth. Life is short. Eternity is long. And we aren't in charge. God is. And he's in the eternity business. See, when we suffer, we often have Job-like revelations in the peak of the very storm that caused so much pain. And it's there, in the middle of the storm, where you might find the answer to a lifelong prayer for direction, or a healing of some kind, or understanding of who God really is. Job found the God he had been looking for, not by avoiding the storm, but by holding on to a thread of faith as he went directly to the center of the hardest of hard times. God was revealed best by the very storm that seemed to cast a cloud around God's presence. Friends, the story of Job is the story of one person going into the darkness so that you and I could walk our path in the light. It's a difficult story to grab hold of, and it often leaves us with as many questions as it does answers. Job's story is Jesus' story. David's story. The apostles' story. And the story of every person of faith since. It's a story of fear and suffering and great loss, and through these trials, we can begin to understand the power and the truest character of God. See, Job's story is my story, and it's yours, or it likely will be, because the truth is the storms are coming. Or we've already survived them and just hope they're over for good. They come for all of us, don't they? Whether we accept that as a part of life or suggest that believing as a people of faith that pass around us, we get to choose. Just like we get to choose whether we meet or reject God in those circumstances. Job's message? Well, you get to choose. But for me, it's a reminder to look squarely and honestly into the center of the dark clouds and the raging storm. For it's there we'll find that God has kept his promises to never leave us, to never forsake us. He'll stand through the storms by our side. And he'll never stop using us to come alongside others who stand in the storm, to share Job's story and ours for his glory, and to make a difference in the lives of others. May the storms of life pass, but if they don't, recognize the bruises you find in the aftermath, well, they're from God hanging on to you so tightly in the midst of the storm. Amen. Would you please stand and join us in the hymn of response?